For 100 years, I watched the world through the inside of my own frozen breath. That is the truth. No one who ever told my story knew that I was awake in there. They said the last true Alpha King of Lormville had been turned to a statue of clear crystal, a cold ornament on a cold throne, a thing to be pitied by the soft-hearted and forgotten by everyone else. They did not know that behind the glass a man still stood at his full height, seeing everything, hearing everything, unable to move so much as an eyelash, unable to lift a single sound in a throat that had gone hard and bright and still as a winter pond. 100 years is a long time to stand and see, and never once be seen. I could tell you how it began, and I will, because you should understand what kind of king I was before I tell you what a poor girl made of me. If I do not show you the hard thing I was, you will not understand the mercy that broke me, and the mercy is the whole of the story. I was proud, not with the small vanity of a young lord who likes his own reflection. Lormville bred 100 of those every generation, and I had no patience for them. My pride was colder and deeper than vanity. I believed all the way down in the marrow that a true alpha needed no one. I had reasons, or what I took for reasons. My father had leaned on his counsel, and they had bled him slow, a favor here and a concession there, until the crown he handed me was half the weight it should have been. My mother had loved a man who did not deserve the loving, and when he proved what he was, grief took her before her time and left me to watch it. I drew the wrong lesson from both. I decided that to want was to be weak, that to lean was to be cut, and that the only safe king was a king who was a fortress with no gate. So I built myself that way. I ruled well. They did say that of me, and it was true. The borders were quiet. The granaries stood full through the worst winters. The lesser packs that had squabbled for 100 years before me kept a wary peace, because they knew the name Hailwind and knew what it would cost to test it. I held all of that alone, with nothing but my own will and my own name, and I was proud of holding it alone most of all. When my council brought me their daughters and their careful alliances, one after another down the years, I sent them away. Not cruelly, I was not a cruel man, whatever else I was, but firmly, and with a coldness that told each of them plainly there was no gate here to knock at. When my own wolf strained inside me toward the empty place at my side where a mate was meant to stand, when it turned its head at a scent on the wind and whined low in the dark of me, I told it to be silent. And because I was strong and stubborn and a fool, for a long time it obeyed. I thought that silence made me strong. It only made me a man with no one at his back, in a hall full of people who were waiting to learn whether he could be moved. My cousin Cale learned it before I did. He was the son of my father's younger brother, and he had grown up in the corners of my hall in the spaces a proud king never troubles to look at. He was quiet. He was useful. He remembered a man's name and his grievances and his gout, and he brought the right word at the right moment, and he smiled a smile I had seen 10,000 times and never once troubled to read. I never feared him. Why would I fear Cale? He had no wolf worth the name, a thin gray thing that would not have held its ground against a yearling, and no talent for anything but patience. I mistook his patience for loyalty, because it cost me nothing to mistake it. That is the flaw that pride hides best. Pride lets you believe that the man who never challenges you must love you, when the plain truth is that he is only waiting, with the long patience of the overlooked, for the day you turn your back. And behind Cale, though I did not know it, there was the witch. They called her the Gray Woman, and she lived above the tree line, up where the moon touched the bare rock before it touched anything else that lived, and no alpha in 3 generations had been fool enough to climb that far up to bargain with her. Cale was not a fool. He was something worse. He was a patient man with a lifetime of small grievances, and he took my father's old buried debts and a great deal of my own gold up that cold mountain, and he came back down with a curse in a stoppered jar and a smile I still had not learned to read. He waited as he waited for everything, for exactly the right night. He chose the longest night of the year, the deep of midwinter, when my whole court gathered in the great hall of the Verine. My grandfather had built that hall, and it was the wonder of the north. He had made it of glass and mirror and worked silver, floor to vault, so that a single candle set at its heart would be caught and thrown and multiplied 1,000-fold, and the whole vast room would burn like the inside of a star. On feast nights we lit 1,000 true candles besides, and the Verine blazed so that men said you could see its glow from the passes 3 valleys off, a crown of light on the dark shoulder of the mountain. I loved that hall. It was the one soft thing I let myself love, because it was stone and silver and could not leave me. I stood at the head of it that night in my grandfather's silver circlet, proud and alone as ever, watching my court eat at my table, and Kale came to me through the light with a cup of dark wine in his 2 hands and that smile on his face. "To the king," he said, and lifted the cup to me before he gave it, and his voice carried down the bright hall so that the nearest tables turned to hear. "To the king who needs no one." I should have heard it. 100 years I have had to hear it again, and every time it lands like a blade. "The king who needs no one," said gently, said almost fondly, by the one man in the hall who had understood the shape of my whole life and meant to use it to end me. But I heard only a courtier's flattery of the kind I was too proud to enjoy and too proud to refuse, and I took the cup, and I drank. I even smiled back at him. That smile is the last thing my own face ever did that I chose. The cold came up through me from the floor. Not like ice, I want you to understand this, because the difference is the whole cruelty of it. Ice numbs, ice takes feeling away. This was not that. This was glass forming, a hardening and a stilling and a terrible clarity, and it spread up through my legs and my spine and my chest while every nerve in me stayed awake to feel it come. I felt my heart slow and then hold. I felt the cold close over my open eyes, and the whole shouting, screaming, overturning hall went smooth and silent and far away, seen through a pane that would never break, and I was still inside it, awake, aware, a man frozen mid-breath at the head of his own feast. I heard the gray woman's voice then, though I never saw her. It came as if from the bottom of a deep lake, slow and cold and certain, and it spoke the terms of the thing that had been done to me plainly, spoke them out loud to the whole court on purpose, so that every soul in that hall would carry the words out into the world, and no one ever would trouble to come and undo them. "He is sealed in what he made himself," she said, and there was no malice in it, which was worse than malice. There was only certainty, the way winter is certain. Cold glass that needs no one and can hold no one, so he will stand awake and alone and seeing until the day one living soul freely gives this king the thing he never asked for and wants nothing back for the giving. Love with no throne behind it, mercy with no reward. On that day, and no sooner, the glass will remember that it was once a man. She was quiet a moment, and then she laughed low, and the laugh went through the frozen hall like a draught. "It will not come," she said. "A king is loved for his crown. Take the crown away and stand him cold in a corner where no one has to look and see who kneels, see who gives and wants nothing. 100 years I give it. 100 years, and then even I will be curious to have been wrong." And then into the ringing silence, Kale reached up and lifted my grandfather's silver circlet from my frozen brow and set it on his own and turned to face the hall. I have had a long time to think about what happened next, and I have made my peace with most of it. My court, the men and women who had eaten at my table an hour before, who had sworn to me, whose fathers had sworn to my father, looked at the bright, cold thing I had become, and looked at Kale standing there with the crown on his head and the witch's voice still hanging in the air, and one by one, they knelt to him. I would like to tell you they were villains. A few of them were, but most were only frightened people in a hall gone suddenly full of dark magic, people with children at home and lives they wish to keep, and frightened people do small things and afterward call those small things sense. I have had 100 years to forgive them, and I have. It is easier, I have found, to forgive a whole frightened crowd than to forgive the one man who poured the wine. The crowd only bent. Kale chose. So Kale was king, and I was a curiosity in the corner of my own hall. For a while they came to look at me. I was a marvel in a grim way, the frozen king, the clear man, and the bolder among the court would rap a knuckle against my crystal arm to hear the sound, or lean close to my glass eyes to see whether anything moved behind them, and nothing did because nothing could, though I was screaming at every one of them from the sealed dark inside. Children were lifted to see me and frightened by me. A painter came and made a study of me for a book of curiosities. And then, in time, they stopped coming, the way people stop coming to anything that never changes. The world outside my glass went on, and I watched it go. Kale could not hold what I had held. That was the first thing I learned in my long watching, and I will not pretend it did not give me a cold, bitter satisfaction in the early years, before I learned better. The peace I had kept with nothing but my name began to fray the moment a lesser man wore the crown. The lesser Pax tested him and found him soft and pressed. A war came that I would have prevented with a word, and Kale prevented nothing, and the granaries I had filled emptied to feed it, and the borders I had held drew inward valley by valley. The court, needing to be near the fighting and the failing, moved down out of the high Varing to a squat gray keep on the low ground, and one gray morning they simply left and did not take me with them. I was too heavy or too strange or too much a reminder. They shuttered the great doors of the Verine, and they left the frozen king standing alone in the hall of 1,000 mirrors. And they went down the mountain, and the mountain closed over the memory of me like water over a stone. Then began the long forgetting, and the long forgetting was the hardest thing of all, harder than the cursed night, harder even than the end when it nearly came. Understand, a man cannot go mad the way a free man goes mad, not in that state. There is no pacing to spend the fear on, no wall to strike, no cry to loose. There is only the fear, and it has nowhere to go, and so it turns inward and sits down inside you and stays. I learned in those first shut-in years that I would have to make a mind for myself that could bear to be still, or I would come apart behind the glass, and no one would ever know I had. So I counted. It sounds like a small thing. It was the discipline that kept me a man. I counted the tall panes of the Varine's high windows, 340, and I checked the number by seasons as one by one the ivy came through and cracked them. I counted the beams of the vault. I counted the silver studs in the great doors when the moon came through and lit them. I named over and over the packs of the north and their old boundaries, so that I would not forget the map of the world I had ruled. I recited to myself the little I remembered of my mother's voice, and my father's few lessons, and the names of the men who had knelt to Kale, so that I would not forgive them too soon before I understood them, and then later so that I could. The Verine aged around me. The great mirrors clouded, silver going to gray, until my 1,000 reflections dimmed to ghosts of themselves, and then to nothing. Dust came down from the failing vault like a slow gray snow and settled on my frozen shoulders and did not melt, and no one brushed it away. Ivy found the broken high windows and came in and made green ropes down the walls, and birds nested in the beams. And once a whole spring a pair of them raised their brood on my grandfather's silver cornice, and I watched every day of it, glad past telling of the small warm life, and grieved when autumn took them south. And the wolves came. They came in through the door that had rotted off its lower hinge, the wild wolves of the mountain, and here is a thing that cut me deepest of all. They were my own kind gone kingless. Somewhere in the tangle of the war and the failing years, packs of true wolves had drifted up into the high country masterless, and they found the ruined Verine a shelter from the worst of the winter, and they came in and slept in a heap on the cold floor of my hall, under the frozen king who had once run at the head of 1,000 of their kind. They did not know me. Why would they? I was a cold thing in the corner, no scent to me, no warmth, no wolf that they could feel. They slept beneath me all unknowing, and in the deep of the winter nights I stood my 100-year watch above them, and my own frozen wolf turned inside me, straining, grieving, wanting to go down among them and be known, and could not, and could not, and could not. That was the taste of those years. Not the pain of the cold, which I had long stopped feeling. The slow, patient work of 100 winters taking my name off the face of the world one grain at a time, until there was no one left alive who had ever spoken it, and the frozen king in the Hall of Mirrors was not even a story any more, only a shape in the dark that the wolves slept under and did not question. And then, in a winter I had long since stopped numbering, a light came down the aisle. I saw it before I understood it. After so long in the graying dark, any light at all was a shock, and this was only a single small flame, a candle in a tin cup, held low and cupped against the draft from the broken door. It came in slowly. It came all the way down the long, ruined length of my hall, past the clouded mirrors that no longer gave it back, past the sleeping shapes of the wolves who lifted their heads and watched it pass, and strangely did not rise or flee, and it stopped at the foot of my dais and lifted. And for the first time in longer than I had the number for, warm living light fell on my frozen face. Behind the candle was a girl. She was wrapped to the eyes in rough gray wool against the cold, and when she pushed the muffle down from her face to see me better, I saw that she was young, and plain in the way that only means no one has ever troubled to tell her otherwise, chapped cheeks, a cold-reddened nose, a stray dark curl come loose across her brow, and steady gray eyes that took me in without fear and without wonder. She did not look at me the way the old court had looked at me, as a marvel, or a warning, or a curiosity to rap a knuckle against. She looked up at me the way you look at a person you have come upon alone in a place they should never have been left, and your first feeling is that it is a shame, and your second is that you had better see to them. "Oh," she said softly, up into my frozen face. "There you are." I had heard nothing spoken to me, not one word meant for me, not one you in 100 years. I cannot make you feel what those 3 plain words did. It was not the bond, The bond came later, and I will tell you exactly when and how, because it did not come the way an alpha is taught to expect, and I want the truth of it on the record. It was something simpler and in that moment larger. For 100 years I had been in it a thing, a shape, a frozen marvel, then a shuttered ruin, then nothing at all. And a poor girl with a candle had walked the length of my dead hall and looked at the cold thing in the corner, and without knowing anything, called it you, called it there. In the mind of one tired girl, on one winter evening after 100 years, I was a him again. A person who might be spoken to. A person is a small thing to be. I had been a king. I would have traded every day of the crown for that one word, you spoken kindly, 100 years too late. Her name was Elowen, and she was the candle keeper. I learned all of it over the weeks and months that followed because she told me. That was her way. She talked to me while she worked, easily, without weight, the way a shepherd talks to a good dog or a widow to her garden, never expecting an answer and never once unsettled by the silence. It was, I came to understand, the great loneliness of her own life reaching out to the only thing quieter than itself, and I was so glad of it that if I could have wept for gladness, I would have flooded the floor of my hall. She was an orphan of the mountain villages, she told me, taken in young by the old woman who had held the keeper's post before her, and when the old woman died, Elowen had simply gone on doing the work, because no one had told her to stop, and it had seemed a poor thing to let 100-year duty lapse just because the person who taught it to you was in the ground. The work was this, and only this, to climb up to the shuttered Varine once each fortnight through the cold seasons, and keep a light burning near the frozen king, because 100 years ago someone had left a small endowment and a rule, and the rule read in the old book that came with the post, the keeper shall not let the king stand in the dark. Endowments outlive their reasons. Rules outlive the men who make them. That is the whole reason I was tended at all. Kale's line had never troubled to end the keeper's post. It cost a few coins a year, and it kept a strange old story quietly buried up a mountain no one climbed. And there is nothing a usurper's heirs like better than a strange old story kept quiet and buried. So the coins came down the generations, and the keepers came, one after another, a long line of them across the century, and each one lit a candle and trimmed it and went home down the mountain before dark. None of them, Elowen told me once, laughing at a page of the old book, had ever written a single word about what the frozen king was like. I suppose there's nothing much to write, she said, drawing a fresh candle from her satchel. You're very quiet company. And she smiled at her own small joke, up at my still face, as if the two of us were old friends who might share it, and something moved in me that had not moved in 100 years, though nothing on the glass could show it. The others had all done their duty. Every one of them had kept the light and kept the rule and gone home. Elowen did the one thing none of them had ever thought to do. She kept me company. She was not required to. The rule said only keep the light, it said nothing of staying. But the walk down the mountain was long, and the winter dark came on early and hard, and so more and more Elowen would build a small fire in the great cold hearth at the side of my hall, and sit the dark hours through, wrapped in her gray wool with her knees drawn up, and talk to me. She told me about the village and the goats, and the man at the market who put his thumb on the scale, and the woman 2 doors down who had been kind to her once when no one else was, and how she had never forgotten it, because when you have been given little, you keep every kindness like a coin. She told me she was lonely. She told me plainly, the way people will only admit a hard thing to something they are certain cannot repeat it, and then she caught herself and laughed and said, "Listen to me." Telling my sorrows to a statue. And I stood there and heard her and understood her, and would have given anything I had ever owned to say, the statue has heard you and is honored by it, and is not sorry to be trusted. She noticed things about me that 100 years of courtiers never had, not because she was cleverer, though she was clever, but because she looked. Courtiers had looked at what I meant. Elowen looked at me. She noticed one evening, holding her candle up close, that my frozen hand was open, not closed at my side, but open, held a little from my body, the fingers slightly spread. "You're reaching for something," she decided, tipping her head. "Aren't you, a king frozen reaching for something?" She looked around the empty, ruined hall as if she might find what it was. I wonder what. I could have told her. It would be a while yet before I understood it myself. She noticed that the cold glass of me caught the firelight in a certain way, and that on some nights in the low red light of her hearth it looked as though there were warmth living in my face. "You had a hard look about you, I think," she told me on one of those nights, studying me across the fire, her chin on her knees. When you were a man, but not a cruel one, a hard, lonely look. I think you were a person who didn't let anyone stand close to you, and I think you were sorry for it underneath, and far too proud to ever say so. She said it gently, and idly, with no idea in the world how near to the bone it went. How she had, in 3 sentences, spoken the truth of my whole life more plainly than any man who had lived beside me for years. And where her words landed, something in me that had been all cold crystal for 100 years grew a single warm seam, a thin bright line of thaw running through the ice of me, and the seam did not close. That was the bond. I will tell you the truth of it, because I have heard how alphas speak of the bond, the howl of it, the flare, the wolf rising up in a man like a wave. It was nothing like that for me, and it could not have been. I had no wolf that could rise, no body that could flare, no throat to howl from. My bond was quieter and stranger than any bond an alpha is warned to expect, and it was made of exactly what she was. One warm seam, opened by a kind and careless truth spoken over a low fire, running through 100 years of ice, and refusing from that night on ever to freeze over again. My wolf, frozen with the rest of me, turned in the dark of my glass toward the small warm shape by the fire and knew her, the way you know your own name spoken suddenly in another room. Her, the one my counsel had brought me 100 pale versions of, and I had sent every one away. She had climbed a mountain to keep a candle burning for a dead man's forgotten story, and she was mine, and she did not know it, and I could not tell her, and I could not reach her, and I could not so much as turn the frozen hand that had been reaching all along without knowing for her. Do you understand the cruelty in that? The gray woman had not planned it, I am sure. She had cursed me to be alone forever, and thought the cruelty complete. But fate has its own hand in these things, and fate answered her curse by bringing the one soul in the world who could end my loneliness to within a single arm's length of me, and freezing the arm. I found my fated mate after 100 years alone, and I was made of glass, and I could not tell her, or touch her, or shield her, or do any of the 1,000 things every fiber of a mated alpha exists to do. I could only stand and see and love her helplessly from inside a curse that was breaking so slowly I could not even be sure it was breaking at all. So I loved her the only way that was left to me. I kept watch. It was a useless watch, and I kept it with my whole heart. When the wind came howling through the broken door and bent her small hearth fire flat and threatened to snuff it, I willed it with everything in me to hold, and sometimes it held, and I let myself believe foolishly, gratefully, that I had done it. When she slept by the fire, curled in her gray wool with her satchel for a pillow, I stood my 100-year watch over the small rise and fall of her breathing, and I dared anything on that black mountain to come near her, and nothing ever did, and I told myself foolishly that this too was me. A frozen king is a poor guardian, but I guarded her all the same, with the only thing the curse had left me, which was my attention, entire and unbroken, night after night, season after season. And here is the thing about Aloan that I must make you understand before I tell you the rest, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. She did not grow tired of me. She grew kinder. Kindness, for most people, is a current they can swim against only so long before they weary and let it carry them back to shore, back to themselves. 100 years of keepers had felt the small tug of pity for the frozen king, had lit the candle a little gently perhaps, and then had gone home to their own lives and thought no more of it. That is not a fault. That is how most hearts are made. But Aloan never wearied. The longer she tended a king who could give her nothing, no thanks, no wage past the keeper's few coins, no company that answered, no warmth that reached back, the softer she became toward me, not the harder. And she began, absurdly, to bring me things. The first was a flower. Late in a cold spring, she found one clinging to the rock on her climb-up, a small, stubborn white thing, and she carried it all the way to the Varine and reached up on her toes and set it in my open, frozen hand, closing the crystal fingers around the stem as best she could. "There," she said, stepping back to look. "A king should hold something." It stayed there weeks and dried, and I have never in my life, before or since, been given a gift that undid me the way that dead white flower did, held in a hand I could not close, by a girl who thought no one would ever see it but her. Then it was the banner. Behind my throne there had hung, since my grandfather's day, the great banner of Lormville, a running wolf worked in silver thread on a field of deep blue, and in the long neglect it had rotted at the top and fallen and lay in a heap of ruin in the corner. One evening Aloan dragged it out, and spread it on the floor by her fire, and set to mending it, stitch by patient stitch, over a whole winter of evenings. When I understood what she was doing, I could hardly bear to watch. It moved me so. "It seemed a shame," she said, biting off a thread. "A king with a torn flag. Even you." She caught herself before she said even a frozen one, and colored, and I loved her so much in that moment that the warm seam in my chest widened another finger's breadth, and a second seam started beside it. That was the winter I began to feel the curse move. I do not know how else to say it. For 100 years I had been changeless glass. Now on the night she stayed and talked and mended and was kind, I felt faintly at first, so faintly I mistrusted it, the ice of me warm by a hair and thin and start in the smallest hidden places to remember it had been a man. It went no faster than her kindness went, and her kindness asked for nothing and expected nothing, and so the thaw was slow, so slow a seam a season. But it did not stop, and it did not close, and for the first time in 100 years I had something I had long since taught myself never to have, which was hope. It was a terrible thing to have hope after so long without it. It hurt more than the cold ever had. I would not have traded it for anything. And then came the night of the candles, which I will remember, I think, past the last day of my life. It was midwinter, the same deep of the year I had been cursed on, 100 years before, though only I knew that. Elowen came up the mountain that evening with her satchel bulging and heavy, and when she reached the Varine she set it down and began to take out of it, one after another, stub after stub of half-burnt candles, dozens of them, scores of them, a whole year's worth of ends and pieces that she had been saving. I realized, saving all the year, denying herself a little light on her own dark evenings so that she could carry the saved ends up here. She did not explain herself at first. She only went quietly around the whole ruined hall, up on the sills and the ledges and the fallen cornices, setting the little stubs everywhere, on every surface that would hold one, all the length and breadth of the great glass room. And then she went round again with her one lit candle and touched it to each of them, patiently, 100 small flames waking one after another in the dark of the Varine, and my grandfather's mirrors, clouded and gray as they were, still caught them. Dimmed, ghosted, but there, the light multiplied and threw itself back and gathered, and the whole vast hall began faintly, softly to glow, the way it had glowed the night I was cursed, when it burned like the inside of a star. But warm this time, and quiet, and lit not by 1,000 true candles for a feasting court, but by a poor girl's whole hoarded year of saved ends, for an audience of one frozen man and herself. When the last stub was lit, she went and stood in the very middle of it all, in the heart of the light, and she turned around slowly on the spot, once all the way round, looking up at the soft glow gathering in the failing mirrors, at the light living again in the dead hall, and I saw that she was crying a little and laughing at herself for crying, the way she always did. And then she stopped turning, and she looked up at me across all that gentle light, and she said, "There, now you've seen it lit." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I found it in the old book that it used to be all mirrors and 1,000 candles, and it would shine so the whole valley could see. And I thought he stood here 100 years in the dark of it and never once seen it the way it was meant to be. So," she looked around at her 100 small flames and shrugged, shy of her own tenderness. "It's not 1,000, but I wanted you to see it lit once, before, well, once. If I could have wept, I would have wept until the mountain flooded. I want to be honest with you, because she has earned an honest telling if anyone ever did. I have wondered in all the long, grateful years since whether I loved her because she was my fated mate, or whether fate chose her to be my mate because she was, of all the souls in the world, the one kind enough to love a man frozen out of it, to light 100 saved candles for a statue, to mend the flag of a dead king, to set a flower in a hand that could not hold it. I have decided at last that it does not matter which. The bond was true, and the girl was true, and the girl was by far the finer of the two. The bond only pointed the way. Elowen was the one who climbed the mountain, fortnight after fortnight, year after year, and stayed the dark through, and grew kinder, and never once asked for a single thing back. That, in the end, was the exact shape of the key. She never once asked for anything back. Down in the low keep in those same years, Cale was an old, old man and afraid. 100 years is long even for our kind, and Cale had bought the length of it the same way he bought everything, up the cold mountain from the gray woman, in gold and in worse coin than gold. But a long life is not a good one, and I have come to believe that the length he bought was itself a kind of punishment, though he never saw it so. His reign had been a slow, grinding ruin from the first year to the last. The name that had held the North together was frozen in a hall no one visited, and no name of Kale's could take its place. The lesser packs carved at the borders like crows at a carcass. The alliances curdled. The people who had knelt to him in my bright hall 100 years before had children, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and every generation of them was hungrier and colder and angrier than the last, and every one of them cursed the name of the king in the low keep for the taxes and the failing and the endless small wars. A stolen crown is heavy in a way, an earned one never is. Kale had worn mine for a century, and it had not made him a king. It had only worn him down to a frightened old man in a cold keep, jumping at the dark. And near the end, the dark he jumped at most was me. That is the thing the powerful never understand until it is far too late, that the thing you bury alive is the very thing you will come, in the end, to fear above all others. For most of the 100 years Kale had told himself I was only glass, an old story, a curiosity up a dead mountain, no more a danger to him than the mountain itself. But near the end, sick and sleepless and haunted, he began to dream of the gray woman's words, the words she had spoken plain to his whole court on the cursed night, so that they could not be lost, until one soul freely gives this king what he never asked for and wants nothing back for the giving. And a cold thought took root in Kale's failing mind and would not be pulled out. Someone was still tending the candle up at the Vereen. The keeper's post had never lapsed. The coins still went out every year in his own ledgers. Someone, all this long while, had been keeping a light burning for the frozen king. And a light kept faithfully for 100 years up a mountain by whoever would take so poor and strange a post. What kind of soul kept a light like that, if not exactly the kind of soul the curse was waiting for? The kind that gives and wants nothing back. So the old man, in his fear, did the thing frightened, powerful men always do at the last. He decided to make certain. He sent a man up the mountain to see. I saw him before Alowan did. He came in the daytime, which no keeper ever did, and he wore Kale's colors, and he had not come to keep a light. He walked the length of my hall slowly, and he looked at me a long time with a cold, measuring, weighing look that I knew far too well. For I had worn that very look myself once on my own hard face in the days when I weighed men and found them wanting. And then he stopped looking at me and began to look at everything else. At the small, freshly trimmed candle, at the swept place before the dais, at the great blue banner, mended and hung back in its place behind my throne, at the dried white flower still held in my frozen open hand. And I watched him understand exactly what he was looking at. This was not a keeper keeping a rule. This was someone keeping me, tending me, a person and not a duty. And I saw the understanding settle into his cold face. And I knew, with a dread deeper than any I had felt in 100 frozen years, precisely what he would carry down the mountain to the frightened old man in the keep. He went down and he told Kale, and Kale, at the very end of his long stolen life, did the last and worst thing his fear could reach for. He decided to end the story once and for all, not to let it break, but to break it first himself, past any mending. The order came up the mountain a fortnight later, carried by 3 armed men and a mason with his tools, and read out at my broken door in the flat, far-off voice of a thing decided long ago in a cold room below. Alowan met them at the door with her candle still burning in her hand. And I stood behind her in my glass, screaming with a throat that had no voice, as the king's man read the order out. The Vereen was to be sealed forever. The frozen king, the old ornament, the order called me in Kale's words, was to be broken up where he stood and the pieces carried out and scattered off the sheer north face of the mountain, so that no whole part of me remained anywhere and no story could ever again gather itself around a cold king in a glass hall. The keeper's post was ended this same day. Her coins were stopped. She was to gather what was hers and go down the mountain before the mason began his work at dawn, and she was never to come back. "You've the night," the king's man said to her, and not unkindly, because even Kale's hard men were underneath it, only men doing a cold thing they had been told to do. "We start at first light. Say your goodbyes to your king tonight, girl, if a statue can hear them." He meant it as a small cruelty, the weary cruelty of a man who wants to be done and gone home, and he did not know how could he know that he had just spoken the truest words said in that hall in 100 years. Then the men made their rough camp out in the frozen outer court, and settled to wait for the dawn, and Alowan came back into the hall alone and set her candle down on the step of the dais, and for a long time she did not speak at all. She built the fire up, higher than she had ever built it, as though warmth could be an argument against the men outside, against the mason's tools, against the morning. She sat down on the cold stone step of my own dais with her back not quite to me and her chapped hands wrapped around her drawn-up knees, and she stared into the flames. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not steady the way it had always been. It shook. "I don't even know your name," she said to the fire. 100 years and no one ever wrote it down. I've read that whole old book front to back, the rule and the coins and how to trim the wick, and there's not one word of your name in it." A short breath of a laugh, and it broke apart in the middle. "I've told you everything. Every foolish thing about me, every sorrow my whole small life, and I don't know one single thing to call you." She turned her head then and looked up at me, and the firelight was on her wet face. "They're going to break you in the morning. Break you up and throw you off the mountain, and I can't stop them. There's 3 of them and a mason and me, and I can't do anything, and I can't even say the right name over it. Over you." She pressed the heels of both her hands hard against her eyes, and when she took them away she went on, low, fast, as though she had to get it all said before her courage failed. "I know it's mad, your glass, you've never once so much as I know all that, but you were the only one who ever stayed." Her voice cracked clean through on the word. "Do you understand that? Everyone in my whole life left or died or went off down the mountain and never once looked back. My mother, the old keeper, all of them, everyone leaves. And you couldn't leave, you were always here. Every time I climbed up out of the dark and the cold and the whole of it, you were here, and you'd heard me the last time, and you'd hear me again. And I know it isn't the same. I know a person who can't leave isn't the same as a person who stays, but it felt the same. For years it felt the same, and it was the only thing in my life that ever did, and I'm not sorry, and I don't care that you're glass." She stood up. She came up the 2 steps of the dais slowly, until she stood close enough that I could have counted the breaths going in and out of her if I still counted anything at all. And she looked up into my frozen face, and she said the last of it. The thing that broke 100-year curse, not grandly, not as a spell, but plainly the way she said everything, because it was simply true and there was no one else in the world to tell. "I love you," she said. "I know that's a foolish thing to say to a statue, but there's no one else to say it to, and it's true, and I wanted it said out loud once before the morning takes you. You don't owe me anything back for it. You never could give me anything back. That was never once why. Love with no throne behind it, mercy with no reward." She reached up. She took my frozen open hand, the reaching hand, with the dust of the dried flower still in it, between her 2 warm living ones, the first living touch to reach me in 100 years, and it went through the ice of me like the sun through a window. She lifted my cold hand a little, and she bent her head over it, and she kissed the back of it softly, the way you kiss the hand of someone you love and are burying. And the glass remembered that it had been a man. It began where her lips touched the back of my hand, and it ran up my arm like a crack racing across a frozen pond in the first hour of the spring thaw. A long, splitting, singing sound, high and bright, that filled the whole hall. And behind the crack came the warmth, terrible and total and 100 years overdue, the warmth of stopped blood suddenly moving, of a held breath suddenly let go, of a heart that had not beaten in a century lurching and catching and beating. The crystal of me sheeted and starred and broke, all over all at once, but the shards did not fall and strike the floor. They turned to nothing but cold air as they fell away, vanishing like frost off a warming pane. And where the king of glass had stood 100 years, all at once there was a man, breathing, staggering, blood-warm, alive, with a poor girl's 2 hands still holding his, and her upturned face gone white as snow with terror and with wonder. My first breath in 100 years tore out of me like a sob, and my second and my third, the body remembering breath, greedy for it, shaking with it. My wolf came up in the same instant, unfrozen, roaring back up into a body that could hold him at last, and the bond that had been for one long winter no more than a single warm seam in the ice flared through the whole of me, entire and blinding. Mine found hers. My legs that had not held me in a century buckled, and I went down onto my knees on the step of my own dais, and I did not let go of her hands. I would not have let go of her hands if the mountain itself had come down, and the first word I spoke, with a throat that had been glass an instant before, the first word in 100 years was her name. Eloand. She made a sound I have no word for, a sound with 100 things in it at once. She was trying to pull back and to pull me closer in the very same motion, the way a person does before a thing far too large to be true. You moved, she could not finish any of it, neither could I. My body knew only one thing to do, and it did it. I folded forward over our joined hands, and I pressed my face to them, and I shook, the whole 100 years of it coming out of me at once. And she came down onto her knees on the cold stone in front of me, among the last vanishing motes of my own broken curse, and she caught me against her and held me, held the sobbing king of Lormville exactly the way she had held every cold and stray and forgotten thing on that mountain her whole life. And she said over and over into my hair, it's all right, I've got you now. And I let her. I who had needed no one my whole life, who had built myself a fortress with no gate and called it strength. I let a poor candlekeeper hold me together on the floor of a ruined hall while I learned, at 100 and some years old, how to be a living man again. And I know now that it was not weakness. It was the first true strength I had ever had in my life, and she taught it to me in the space of a single breath, without knowing she was teaching anything at all. When I could speak, when the shaking eased enough that words would come, I told her. Kneeling there, holding her hands, fast and broken, out of order, I told her everything, that I had heard her. All of it, every night, every fortnight, every foolish sorrow and every kindness. The flower, the flag, the 100 saved candles, all of it. I had seen and heard and treasured every moment of it from inside the glass. That my name was Emeric Halewind, the true king before the king, and that 100 years ago a cousin's cup of wine and a witch's cold spite had sealed me alive in crystal, and told the whole world I was only a curiosity. That the curse could break for one thing and one thing only, for one soul who gave freely and wanted nothing back. And in 100 years, Aloin, no one ever did, 100 keepers came and lit their candles and went home, and no one ever until you saved a whole year of candle ends for a statue. Until you kissed my hand goodbye and wanted nothing. You broke it, and you didn't even know. She wept and pressed her hand over my mouth to stop me, because it was too much to hear all at once. And then she took her hand away, and did not stop me after all. So I told her the last of it, the truest thing, the thing my whole cold, silent century had been straining to say through the glass and could not. You are my mate, I said. My fated one, you have been since the night you sat by that fire and told me I was a lonely man too proud to say so. My wolf knew you before my own mind would let me know you. I have loved you 100 helpless ways all this long winter, and I could not tell you, I could not touch you, I could not so much as turn my hand in yours. I lifted our joined hands between us, mine warm now, her still holding fast, and I looked at them. It was reaching for you all those years. They wondered why the frozen king's hand was open, why he was reaching. I was reaching for you, Aloin. My hand was open 100 years before I ever saw your face, because it was already reaching for you. She looked down at our two hands, and then up at my living face, and I watched her decide to believe an impossible thing. I watched the belief come up into her steady gray eyes the way the dawn comes up over the mountain, slow at the edges, and then all at once all over. And when it had come, she said, in a small, firm, wondering voice, "Then I'm very glad I lit the candles," a breath. "I wanted you to see at once. I didn't know you'd seen everything." "I saw everything," I said. "You were the most beautiful thing that ever walked into that hall in all its days, and I could not tell you, and I am telling you now, and I will tell you every day I have left. There is more, and I will tell it, but I will tell it quickly, because the long heart of this story was the 100 silent years and the one warm winter, and the truest part of it was a girl on her knees in the firelight holding a shaking king together. And everything that came after is only the world at long last, hurrying to catch up with what she had already made true. Cale's men were camped in the outer court, waiting for the dawn and the mason. I did not wait for them to come to me. When the first gray light came, I went out to them, not as an ornament to be broken up and scattered, but as Emeric Halewind, the Alpha King of Lormville, walking out through the great doors of my grandfather's hall on my own 2 feet after 100 years, with the morning at my back and the mirrors of the Varine that I had at Aloin help me uncover, throwing the dawn out around me in a wide, pale blaze. My wolf was loud and whole in me. And at the sound of the true blood woken on the mountain, the wild wolves came. They came out of the trees and the ruins and the drifts, the kingless packs that had slept 100 cold years on the floor of my hall, all unknowing under a frozen king with no scent. But I had a scent now and a wolf and a name, and they knew me. I felt them know me all at once, the way you feel a room turn to look at you. They came down off the mountain to my side and put themselves, without one word of asking, between Aloin and the king's drawn swords. A gray wall of them, hackled and low and utterly silent, waiting on me. The king's men did not fight. There was nothing in any of them that wished to die for a sick old usurper down in a cold keep, and there was a great deal in them. I saw it move across their hard faces one after another. That had grown up on the whispered story of the frozen king, that had some of them, a grandmother who wept when she told it. When 100-year-old story you were half raised on stands up in the dawn in living flesh, crowned in the light of his own hall with the mountain's wolves ranked at his back, you do not raise your sword against it. You go down on your knee. And this time they knelt to me, and this time it was not fear that bent them, and it was not a witch's voice hanging in the air over them. It was the end of 100 years of a shame they had inherited and never chosen, and I did not hold one moment of it against them. I have found it is a simple thing to forgive men who kneel to you out of relief. I came down the mountain that day with the wolves at my flank and Eloin at my side, and the whole plain truth walking with me, and Lormville rose to meet it like a held breath finally let go. 100 years of a stolen crown had left the whole North starving for its true blood, and a king woken from a century-long curse is a story that runs through a hungry country like fire down a dry fuse. The packs I had once held with my name alone remembered the name in a single day. The people who had suffered the long gray ruin of Kael's line came out to see the true king with their own eyes, and stayed to follow him, because a people will forgive almost anything of a king, except that he was never truly theirs. Kael I found in the low keep, old and sick, and at the very last of it, utterly, completely alone as he had made me 100 years before, and with none of the 100 years of quiet company that had, at the end, saved my life from despair. He had bought a century of life and spent every day of it wearing a crown that was never his, and it had left him with nothing and no one, and now he sat in a cold room and looked up at the true king he had frozen, come back living to the door, and he had not even the strength left to be afraid. I did not kill him. I have been asked why more than once in the long years since, and I have thought about it a great deal, and I believe the answer is this. The gray woman had been wrong about one thing, the one thing her whole curse rested on. She had said a king is loved for his crown, take the crown away, and stand him cold in a corner and see who kneels. But a poor girl had knelt to a man with no crown at all, a man who was not even a man, but cold glass in a dead hall, and she had wanted nothing, and she had loved him, and that had broken in a single breath a curse that 100 armed men could not have touched. I had learned the lesson the witch built her whole spell to prove could not be learned. I had learned it too late for my pride, and just barely in time for the rest of my life, that the strong thing is not to need no one. The strong thing is to be worth another soul's freely given kindness, and to have the grace at last to take it. So I let Kael live out the short last season that was left to him, stripped of the crown and the keep and the lie, quiet and cared for and alone with what he had done. It was a mercy, and I chose it on purpose, because I had learned by then that mercy breaks more than curses ever did. As for the gray woman, she was long gone, up her cold, moon-touched rock, and I did not climb up after her. The curse she had wrought to prove that no one loves a crownless king had turned in her own hand, and made me the happiest man in the North. And I decided that was a finer punishment than any I could carry up a mountain to her. To have handed me my whole true life dressed up as a doom, and to know it, and to have been so completely, so beautifully wrong. I made Eloin my Luna, and my queen in the Verine in the great hall of glass and mirror, with all 1,000 candles lit. I had them all lit, every one true candles now, not saved stubs, and the old clouded mirrors taken down and polished bright again until they were clear as still water, so that the light was not dimmed and ghosted the way it had been on her night, but whole and blazing and thrown back 1,000 times, until the Verine burned once more like the very inside of a star, the way it had burned the night I was cursed, but warm this time and glad, and lit for a wedding and not a betrayal. And I thought, standing in the heart of all that light with her hand in mine, of a girl saving candle ends all year in the dark to give a frozen man one dim ghost of this, and I had to look up at the light a while before I could speak, so that the whole court would not see their new king undone. She wore no cloth of gold. She would not hear of it. She said gold would only make her look as if she were pretending to be something, and she was right, as she was nearly always right, and I loved her the more for it. She stood beside me in a plain, deep blue gown, the color of the mountain dusk, with her chapped hands and her steady gray eyes and one dark curl come loose across her brow as it always did, and the whole realm that had forgotten us both looked on the cold king made warm and the poor girl who had warmed him, and this time they did not kneel to a crown. They stood, and they cheered, and that I have always thought was a far better thing than kneeling. I ruled a long time after that, and I did not rule it alone, and learning the difference was the finest and hardest work of my whole long life. I was not always good at it at first. 100 years of needing no one does not come off a man in a day, and there were times I caught myself pulling back behind the old cold walls out of nothing but habit. And every time she saw it, the way she saw everything, and she did not scold and she did not push. She only stayed close and waited, the way she had waited 100 fortnights on a mountain, until the wall came down of its own accord and let her back in. She was the most patient soul I have ever known. She had learned it, I think, tending something that could not answer for years, and I have never stopped being ashamed and grateful that I was the thing that taught her. Eloin keeps the small light still. It is no one's duty anymore. I ended the keeper's post, since the king no longer stands in the dark, but she does it anyway, of her own choosing. A candle in the window of whatever room I am working late in. A lamp left burning at the head of the stair for anyone who might come up in the night. A light set out for the strays and the lost, and the ones who climb up out of the dark places of the world unsure whether anyone at all is still awake to see them come. Someone kept a light for you 100 years, she says when I ask her why she still bothers. When everyone was sure it didn't matter to anyone, it always matters. You never know, she says, and she smiles up at me the way she smiled at a statue once, who's frozen in the corner hearing every word. And there is one last thing which I have kept, and will keep until I am done, and which will keep on after me. When the curse broke, almost all the glass of me turned to cold air and was gone, vanished like frost off a warming pane. But one piece did not vanish. One tall pane of the old cursed crystal held, the piece that had stood over my heart at the center of me, and it did not melt into air with the rest. It only came clear, clear as spring water, and stayed. It is the very pane she was looking through, that first winter evening, when she came down the long dead aisle behind her one small candle and looked up at the cold thing in the corner and said, "Oh, there you are." I had it set into the wall behind the throne where the war banner used to hang, and it hangs there now, clear and bright, catching the light of the whole burning hall and throwing it gently back into the room. There is a small mark on it, low down on the glass. It is the print of a girl's hand. It is from the night she took a frozen king's reaching hand between her two warm ones and kissed it goodbye, and did not know she was breaking the whole world open. In 100 years since, I have never let a single servant clean it, and I have left word that no one is ever to clean it, so that it will stay there, that one clear pane, with the small warm print of a hand upon it, long after I am gone from the hall and the north forgets my face again, as it will. So that whoever sits in that light in the years to come, whoever they are, will know the plain and only truth of how the last curse of Lormville was broken. Not by an army, not by a crown, not by any magic at all in the end. By a poor girl who loved a man who could give her nothing, and wanted nothing back, and kissed his cold hand goodbye. There you are. She said it to me first that winter night, and I have been saying it back to her every single morning of a long and grateful life, across every warm and waking room, for all the years the mountain has been kind enough to give us. There you are, there you are, there you are.